it's the you that resides above all of your egoic identities and attachments. It's the you that doesn't care if you have no money or all the money in the world, because the higher self is aware that we are all just an expression of creation, of the divine. In the world of spirituality and metaphysics and esotericism and all of these kind of new agey type things, it's very easy to get lost in the jargon and the woo-woo and the concepts, and I think that's something that deters a lot of people from exploring their spiritual self or that aspect of existence. And I think it's important to contemplate it at some point or another. And it's also very easy to get lost in it all and to forget about the physical and the emotional aspects of existence as well, etc. So I want to just talk about the higher self, or that concept of the higher self. Like, what is the higher self? When I first started learning about this higher self thingy, I thought of it as something that was outside of me, like literally another person or something, like basically a better version of me that was not me. So it was like out here. And that's not the most empowering way to look at the higher self. Also, it's a very woo-woo way of looking at it, because you're saying there's an imaginary being, basically, that's not me, but is me. And it knows more than me, but I don't know what it knows, even though it is me. And it's just really weird and difficult to comprehend and understand. And ultimately I found that approach and that understanding of it wasn't helpful, it wasn't serving me. So what I've come to realize now about this notion or this concept of the higher self, because it is really fluid and it's changeable depending on who you're talking to or your own experiences, but in my experience I now see the higher self as an aspect of my consciousness. So it is me, but it's the part of me that is aware of the greater picture, perhaps, of this existence, or is aware of my inherent divine nature, or is aware of the unconditional way of moving through life. Or in Buddhism they would say equanimity. Everything just is as it is. There's no preferences. Nothing is better or worse than the other. So I feel that the higher self is the aspect of my consciousness that is aware of these concepts. And from the perspective of the higher self, if your bank account is at 0, that's no different or better or worse than if your bank account was at 10 million. So from the perspective of the higher self, no external situation can harm or tarnish your divine presence or your being. And so from the perspective of the higher self, it's kind of all good all the time. And that's not to say that, on a human egoic level, because the lower self, we would say, or the ego self, that refers to like my identity. So I am David. I have a beard. I'm from Ireland. I am 26. All of these things are relating to my egoic self. So they're attachments. And it's only from the lower self or the egoic self that having no money in my bank account would be an issue, because I have certain stories and attachments to the concept of money and the concept of having nothing in a bank account. I would associate that with being poor, being a failure, being homeless, letting down my family and friends and society, not meeting expectations. Those are all lower self beliefs. They all come from the belief system of the lower self or the egoic self. Whereas the higher self doesn't see his self as David, doesn't see himself as being poor or unworthy or a failure. It just sees me in this moment, and each moment has an opportunity in it. So the only difference is that the external surrounding those moments and the opportunities are going to look different and be perceived differently by the egoic self, or by David, or by the lower self. And it's common that if I'm in a situation that, David as an ego doesn't like, for example, having no money in the bank account, I'm quite likely to panic and freak out and do a load of stuff that probably isn't in alignment with my heart or the greater picture of life in terms of, unconditional love and kindness and compassion. It's quite probable that if I'm feeling scared that I might do something that harms another person, and I don't mean like physically, although you could rob somebody if you're feeling desperate enough. That happens. But another way of looking at it would be, trying to sell something to somebody, but from the intention of malice, or I want them to pay more for, say, I don't know, a guitar. Say I'm selling a guitar. I'm trying to sell the guitar for more than it's actually worth because I want that money. But in doing so, I'm taking money from this other person and being dishonest. And that's only a reflection of my understanding of self at that point in time. But from the perspective of the higher self, or that aspect of consciousness that is aware that even though shit has hit the fan, the bank account is at zero, there is still a way to navigate this with love and compassion and patience, most importantly, because in the egoic self, we're trying frantically to do things. And when you're frantically doing things in a panic, the result is often more panic. Or maybe you have a brief solution or a brief moment of respite, but ultimately it leads to panic. For the moment of respite might be in vain, or it might be as a result of bad intention. So the higher self is just a part of you that, despite the panic, finds peace and knows that all will be well. So looking at the higher self as something outside of you, I don't think it's empowering. I don't think it's beneficial. It's really just an aspect of your consciousness. It is you. But it's the you that resides above all of your egoic identities and attachments, It's the you that doesn't care if you have no money or all the money in the world, because the higher self is aware that we are all just an expression of creation, of the divine. We are all walking gods, basically, just like the leaves are, just like the little mouse you see running through the fields. They're all an expression, a manifestation of this source energy, this divine existence. We're all the same, we just look different. And the higher self is aware of that. So the higher self moves and acts with love and patience and kindness, and doesn't hold on to any fear or attachment or expectation, whereas the lower self, the ego, loves to have expectations. He loves to know what next week is going to present to him. He loves to know what the weather is. He loves to know how his bank account is doing. But the higher self doesn't need to know any of that, because the higher self lives from moment to moment without expectation, with nothing but love, unconditional of the circumstances. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for being here, and have a beautiful day.